It is time for today's AM Minnesota program, and we are going to be talking about wrapping up the growing season, hopefully getting into harvest very soon. My guest in the program, familiar voice to KDHL listeners and all farmers in the area, Tom Hoverstad, who's a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. Tom, welcome back to the program.
Good morning, Jerry, and everyone around.
What was it, about a month you and I talked, and we were all pretty optimistic then. I think we're still kind of optimistic, but boy, it just keeps raining.
Yeah, we're really, rainfall records are starting to fall. We had our wettest 2-month period on record, July and August. We had our second wettest July, and we have 100 years of records, just a little bit over. We started in about 1915, so our second wettest July, and we followed that up with our second wettest August. In fact, August was our second wettest month ever. Our wettest month was September of 2010, the year of the big fall flood. A lot of communities had 8-10 inches of rain in one night, and we had over 12 inches of rain that month. This August, we just came a little short of that, 11.7. So really some wet, and it was by far our wettest 2-month period, 20 inches of rain. And those numbers, certain farms could vary probably 6 inches. The nature of the rains we had, we'd get heavy rain for quite a while, and it might not, a couple miles away, it might not rain so much. I know one of the rains, my gauge in my yard here in Waseca, I had over 4 inches, and our official gauge here had 1 inch. So you could see that kind of variability in just a couple miles.
And the problem is we flipped the calendar to September, but we didn't shut the spigot off yet.
No, I was hoping for some dry weather. I even heard somebody on the radio talking about, I see the pattern changing. This was about 2 weeks ago, and he said, I see the pattern changing. I think Minnesota is going to dry out. The southern Corn Belt, eastern Corn Belt, maybe will stay in the wet pattern, but I see dry weather coming to Minnesota. Well, it hasn't happened yet.
I just keep thinking Mother Nature always wants to go back to normal, so we've been so much wetter than normal for so long. I keep dreaming maybe that the pendulum swings the other way. We're much drier than normal for a month and a half, and we have a beautiful low-stress harvest. I'm dreaming, I guess.
That would be nice, and actually we did go into this, January, February, March, April, and maybe even May. We were slightly below normal in precipitation, so... But we certainly caught up. We didn't need to catch up that bad. But we live in a rare part of the world where too much rain can often be a problem. We do things to remove the excess water from the soil. There's a lot of areas in the world where any rainfall they get is a blessing. So most people don't listen to what we say when we don't want rain. That's kind of a unique, and when you listen to most of the news media, when they do predict rain, they often say something like much needed rain coming this weekend or whatever, and we kind of feel the opposite.
But it just seems like it's just been going on for forever. It's so many Julys and Augusts, it's dry, and you're praying for rain, and you're looking at the radar, hope that little cloud comes my way. And this year it's just, please go away.
Yeah, this year is one, there are a lot of years, yes, when it's July and it's plenty warm, and you're saying to yourself, boy, a half-inch of rain would be just right, and then they forecast rain. They talk about a 50% chance, and you don't get anything. This year, they put a 20% chance on, and
you get 2 inches. It just seems to be the pattern that we're in. I know Mark Seeley always talks about the patterns and the persistence sometimes that they can have.
I think the one thing that he's talked about that is probably what we're seeing and affects us the most is, there's a lot of talk about global climate change, and what he's seeing, and not a lot of people talk about it, but he said what seems to be a pattern is more moisture in the atmosphere at the mid-latitudes. And that's where we are. We're halfway from the equator to the pole, and that would be mid-latitudes, and he said we generally are seeing a trend toward more moisture in the atmosphere there. As far as, temperature change, this is an area that I'm really not worried about temperature change because our day-to-day variability is so much that if we warm 1 degree, we won't even notice it.
Tom, before the market break, we were talking about the precipitation records that are starting to fall at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. And like I mentioned, I think we're all hoping for the pendulum to swing back the other way from much wetter than normal to much drier than normal so we can get on with harvest.
Yeah, I've got a campaign slogan this fall. I'm not running for anything, but my slogan is no rain till Thanksgiving. I'd like to see sunshine every day until Thanksgiving and then clean things up a little bit. That's what I've got on order.
The tough part is now that we're so saturated, an inch or an inch and a half of rain is maybe like 3 inches here when we could maybe use a little bit of moisture.
Yes, we do take soil moisture measurements, and we hold 11 inches here, and that's your general listening area is pretty close to that. And our last sample we took was September 1st, and we were right near 11 inches. So that's the problem. We can't hold a lot of water, so when it does rain, it ponds up, and it just takes longer for it to either evaporate or flow away, and crop is not using water anymore like it does in the summer. So we don't need this inch of rain they're talking about coming this week. Speaking about growing season rain, we're closing in on a record. Our wettest growing season ever was 2010, and we talked a little bit about that before. It was that year we had so much rain in September, and we had 34.6 inches for the growing season that year. Our growing season is May 1 through September. We're only 1.3 inches short of that this year, so we get another inch of rain here in September. Could be a record for wettest growing season in our 100-year record base.
Well, looking at those forecasts for tonight through Friday, I mean, some of them are talking 2-3 inches of rain.
Yeah, it sounds like we could be lucky only to get an inch of rain. So let's hope it goes on the drier side. But the one thing we've got going for us this year is we've been warmer than normal, and that I think is going to be very helpful because the corn it really is pretty much ready. I think people are going to have to look at the field conditions a little more than whether their grain is dry. The last wet year we had like this, 2009, we were talking about it earlier before we went on the air, we had a horrible October that year.
That was the year that we weren't getting multiple inches of rain, but we didn't turn a wheel the entire month of October. It was just kind of drizzly all the time.
And it had been cool that year. The corn wasn't quite ready, so we not only had to get dry conditions, we had to get the corn dried down. This year, I think corn drying is not going to be an issue. We're already at about 2,700 growing degree units. Our normal for a season is 2,470, so we're well ahead of that already. And partly because of the warm growing season, and also we had an early planting, so the corn really is going to be ready. So we just need to get a few days where we can dry things up. And I'm still thinking we're going to have a chance to get the crop out in good shape. But I'm an optimist by nature. So
I remember 2009, and the beans were ready, and then it started raining. And I was more concerned about the beans ready to harvest, and they just stood out there for the whole month. And we got to November, it was like flipping the calendar and the switch. It got nice, and the beans were fine, but the corn, I remember combining that year, not only was it wet, but it was all covered with like a black soot or something. The trucks and wagons looked terrible, but by the time it ran through the dryer and all the yuggers, it looked pretty good. Do you remember that too?
Yes, I remember that. I've seen corn when we do get some of this wet weather in the fall, and then the ears stand upright, and we get a lot of rain in there. I've seen corn sprout right on the ear, and then you think, boy, this is going to be a disaster, and you combine it, and you kind of don't even notice it by the time you deliver it. So I don't know how that all happens, but seems like whatever was growing on those. And this year, I think the corn being far along on maturity, I went and sampled some. We've got a planting date study where we ranged from 85 to 109-day corn, and I just looked, the only hybrid in there planted in April when most people planted corn this year, the only thing that hadn't black layered already was the 109 day, so we're in a good position that way. We just need to And I think there's a pretty decent crop out there. Our soils department took some hand-check yields in a study that they did last year, and we had a pretty good crop last year, and their yields this year that they harvested there were equivalent to what they had last year.
You mentioned we've already gotten 2,700 growing degree units. Is your sense, Tom, maybe that those longer day hybrids might shine this year because they had all the heat units?
I think that's a good possibility. I think this was a good year, to especially when we were planting on April 15th, and this would be a year when I think those longer season corns probably are going to look a little better.
What scares me, though, when you mentioned the corn starting to germinate on the ear, I've been reading some things about some sort of mold that's affecting the ears of corn. Starts down at the base, corn hybrids with tighter husks, more susceptible, and it starts turning white and then just kind of spreads up the ear. Was it diplodia or something like that? Haven't heard a lot around here, but more farther south in the I-states.
Yeah, I'm not real familiar with that. I don't think we see it here. I think maybe our husks are already loose enough. I think there's going to be enough air movement through there that I think we're going to be in pretty good shape grain quality-wise. Stalk rot can be an issue. This year we're set up pretty decent because the stalks didn't really have to cannibalize themselves a lot. We had a nice long growing season. Sometimes when the growing season cuts short and plants get shut down early, they kind of take materials out of the stalk and are a little more susceptible to stalk rots, but that's also weather dependent. What I don't want to see is a lot of cool, damp weather. We've been on the warm side, so I haven't seen a lot of stalk rotting organisms, but certainly when the stalks do turn brown, that's a good entry point for some of these organisms, and if it does turn cool and damp, that could be an issue.
If it's a molds, I would think that warm, damp weather would be worse than cool, damp, but maybe the varieties or the species of molds that we have here affecting stalk quality, they like cooler temperature.
I think they survive better in some cooler temperatures. That's just because that's typically what we have in the fall of the year when the corn is ready. So I think they've kind of geared themselves towards adapting to that climate.
I've been hearing about a lot of corn borers out there.
Well, I think corn borer is a pest that, we've grown a lot of BT corn, but there's been a lot more interest in conventional corn. A lot of people are doing that, I think, and I think that's a good idea for corn producers. We've got a lot of good answers for weed control in corn that we don't need to use glyphosate, and I think a lot of people have recognized that. There's been some very good genetics in the conventional side. People are having some luck with that, but we certainly don't see the corn borer like we used to. We've got a bug trap, and we've been catching bugs all summer. Back when we didn't have BT corn, it was not unusual to catch 200, 300, or 400 corn borer a night. This year, we've been going along pretty steady at about 2, 3, 4 corn borer a night. So they're still around. They can, and if we don't grow any BT corn, of course they'll have good eating and a good environment to grow in. So corn borer would come back, but as it is right now, not a huge pest that we really need to treat with a lot of insecticides.
I remember one of those years before we had the BT corn, I was combining at night, and the corn borer moths were just swarming around the lights on the combine. There were so many of them.
Yeah, we used to drive down the road at night and see, bugs splattered on the windshields of cars. A lot of those were corn borer, and that's especially if you were driving around rural areas in corn country. That's what corn borers do. They get together in the grassy areas. Road ditches were perfect for them, and they would congregate there. That's where they do their mating, and we'd see a lot of them, and they're attracted to light. So when a car comes by, they seem to go for those lights, and we'd hit a lot of them.
What are your thoughts on all your research trials, your weed trials? That's kind of one of your specialties. Boy, driving around our listening area, Tom, I see some nice, clean corn and bean fields, and I see some that obviously they're losing the battle against giant ragweed and water hemp.
Well, here's my thoughts. I've been talking about common lamb's quarters, giant ragweed, and water hemp as 3 weeds to watch out for, and I'm starting to feel that I haven't done a very good job because I see a lot of giant ragweed out there and a lot of water hemp. and we're in need of some better answers. I think in the giant ragweed issue, I think as far as most of it, we used to deal with it kind of in the southeast part of the state. It seems to be moving west. But don't feel bad, because we used to mostly see all the water hemp to the west, and that's moving east. So the guys in the east that are donating their giant ragweed to the west, they're getting paid for by water hemp coming their way. And the thing I've seen about giant ragweed is we used to really think about good spring tillage, and we didn't see much of it. If we did a good job of spring tillage and got the crop growing, we didn't see many ragweed coming. But giant ragweed seems to have moved its population to a population that can germinate later in the season, and we're using less of the soil-applied herbicides also, or using rates that usually are a little bit lower than a tough customer like giant ragweed. The seed size is very big, and if they do get a chance to escape those soil-applied herbicides, they can grow, and we seem to have a population that germinates a little bit later and escapes some of them. And now you see them, drive around the countryside, you see a lot of giant ragweed sticking up above the corn. That's going to be the issue, and the bigger issue is in soybeans, because we don't have very good soil-applied answers for giant ragweed in soybeans. So that's where the real issue is. We let a few go in soybeans, and then there's a little bit of a seed bank in corn, and we're not doing a very good job in either crop. So we need to focus on that. There are some good answers. I think the Extend and the Enlist will be a better answer for soybeans. We've got good products in corn already. The growth regulator family, Status, Callisto works pretty good on it. We've got pretty good answers in corn. I think it's just a matter of paying a little more attention to our corn and maybe using a little higher rates of some of these soil-applied products.
But if you are going with the Extend or the Enlist, that's the growth regulators in your beans. You shouldn't be using those in the corn too then, should you?
It would be wise to not have to use the same mode of action in corn and soybeans, and that's what the new Extend or Enlist is, that growth regulator family of chemistry. But I'm talking about for a quick answer. I think in soybeans, I think we probably need a better answer fairly quickly, and I think that will help in some of these situations where giant ragweed has not been manageable the last few years. The good news is, if we can get a handle on giant ragweed, for 3 years, the research shows that we've really depleted the weed seed bank, and if we do a good job of control for 3 years, we've really made some headway and are going to be a lot better off in the future years. Now let's talk about water hemp.
Yeah, that's not true of water hemp, is it?
No, water hemp, the issue there is genetic diversity is huge. Water hemp has male and female plants. That means they're always cross-pollinated. And if you got one escape male plant that sheds pollen and it tolerates Roundup, most of the progeny from that plant are going to tolerate Roundup, which means you may have done a pretty good job on your farm of managing, but that pollen drifts, flows, and my advice is with water hemp, I would treat it as though glyphosate is not going to be very effective on it. So that means we've got some other answers. Liberty soybeans, I think, is probably a pretty good answer. Soil-applied material. On the plus side of water hemp, it's a small seed of broadleaf. Soil-applied materials in soybeans really work pretty good on it.
And so, maybe, Tom, we should come with a booster, so to speak, soil-applied when we're going in maybe later on in June with one of the PPOs, lace it with the soil-applied to give us some extended coverage? That's
a good thought. I think that depends a little on soil types. Some of the lighter textured soils, I think that's a good program. I've tried some of that here on my heavy clay loam soils with high organic matter, adding a little bit of soil-applied chemistry later in the year with our first post-emergence application, and I'm not getting that good of results by some of those lower rates, splitting them out using a lower rate first and then a lower rate of the same product, because a lot of those products have a season total that you can use. and you can't exceed that. Dual or Outlook, for example, has a season total, and it might not be enough half rate each time on some of these heavy clay soils. So I think that's a good answer in some of the lighter textured soils.
One of the things that I noticed when I was out, I had a few escapes, and it was mainly where an area drowned out or was wet or headlands in 13 and 14. And I went out to pull those water hemp weeds, and I hate to admit this, but Lisa Benkin was right. She was mentioning, what's that thing we used to go through when the crop was up and you'd pull some shovels through it? Oh, yeah, cultivating.
Yeah.
And it was amazing when I took note of those escape water hemps, how many of them were directly smack dab between two 30-inch rows. And then I was thinking, see if this sounds logical. I put on my FlexStar GT about June 20th. The beans weren't quite canopied yet. So maybe the water hemp got going in that little open area because that's where most of them were that escaped.
Well, the issue is that we've had such good soil moisture throughout the summers the last few years. And water hemp has the ability to germinate late in the year. It can come up in the middle of August, grow about 6 inches tall, and make quite a bit of seed. So the wet spots, the lower, and any area. The other issue we had a couple of years, 2013, 14, we didn't have the greatest soybean crops, and the canopy wasn't quite there. Give those things a little bit of light, they can germinate in there and get a seed bank. So drown-out areas, water hemp has an advantage in wet soils. So those areas have been an issue, and you're right. I mean, cultivating would be a good option. Not a lot of guys have cultivators anymore. We like to plant with big planters, and we haven't acquired those cultivators that cover that many acres.
It just seems like the prevented plant year 13, and then it was so wet in 14, but we didn't have a lot of prevented plant. But it seems like that's when the jailbreak started of the issues of water hemp and giant ragweed. And I think some of it, too, is, I mean, you couldn't get out in the field, and all at once you could, and you went out there with a field cultivator, and you had ragweed 2 foot tall and water hemp 2 foot tall. You were trying to work down, and we never quite got them killed, and they went to seed. And it seems like, to me, that's when the real issues really got going.
Yeah, and that's the issue with water hemp. Unlike the ragweed we just talked about, water hemp is a prolific seed producer. Doesn't get the seed persists a long time in the soil, and a lot of what happens to giant ragweed is little critters out there like to eat them. They're nice big seeds, and predation is pretty good. Water hemp's a tiny little seed. Not uncommon for one plant to make 500,000 of them, and we just can't get rid of that large of a seed bank very fast. So, yeah, those issues from 2013, the prevented plant when we had tons of wet spots. 14 wasn't a lot better, so we're gonna have to deal with it. The other thing I noticed about water hemp, we kind of moved our pigweed population. Water hemp is in the amaranth family, and we had a product named Pursuit that was very good on pigweed, but it was weak on water hemp, just that little bit of genetic diversity there. And we really, over 20 years of using Pursuit quite a bit in soybeans, I think we kind of shifted our amaranth population more to water hemp than the old pigweed, and that's kind of where it all came from, and it's had some good years the last few years.
Pursuit, is that in the PPO group like the Flex Stars or the Burners, the Blazers, the Cobras? Is that in the same family?
Pursuit's in a different family. It was the imidazolinone family. It was in the same family as we used to have lightning and corn. We used a lot of Pursuit, and that family of chemistry was weak on the water hemps. It's in the ALS family, not unlike Accent and corn. We had that used, similar mode of action to that, and that wasn't very good on the water hemps either.
I have to tell you a quick story, Tom, about my beans after peas, planted July 15th. Got a rain right away, and all at once the beans were up 3 or 4 inches. And usually you don't have to worry too much about weeds planted that late. I saw the beans on one day, and boy, they look really nice. They were growing, no weeds coming. I went out there 4 or 5 days later and almost drove in the ditch, looking at just loaded with water hemp. And I'm going, where the heck did all this come from? Well, I went out there with 1.5 quarts of Durango, generic glyphosate, and Class Act, and I'd say I got about 95% of them. You'd see dead water hemp weeds all over, and all at once here's one that's nice and green.
Yep, that's what happens.
Exactly what you were talking about here a few minutes ago.
You've got some pollen drifting around, and years of glyphosate use, and it doesn't take too long. And I mean, that one that escaped this year, if you didn't go out there and physically remove it or cultivate it, it's going to make quite a few seed. And in 3 years, all of a sudden, that one plant is probably about half an acre in size of a patch that won't be controlled by glyphosate.
But what took me by surprise, too, is I've used a lot of Liberty on my corn. And that's what really caught me by surprise, to see these that were obviously resistant to glyphosate when I've already been using Liberty and atrazine or Lotus on my corn.
Well, like I said, yeah, you could be doing everything right and never have used glyphosate, but the pollen comes from the neighboring fields, and all of a sudden, first time you've tried glyphosate on some water hemp, and it didn't work. Well, it came from somewhere.
And maybe they were a little tall. They were about 4 or 5 inches, but they weren't 2 foot tall, and we used to kill water hemp 2 foot tall with glyphosate.
Yeah, the other issue with water hemp and corn is, it comes up late. If there's a few in there, and I've noticed it's very susceptible to frost. And we typically don't harvest corn until after we've had several pretty good freezes. Soybeans, when you're combining, usually you can see the weeds in there, but corn, those little water hemp, they freeze. They're almost invisible by the time you're combining corn.
So you don't even know
they were there, and voila, there's some seed on the ground.
Yeah. Well, Tom, we've got the news coming up. Always enjoy visiting with you, and I think there are going to be some very interesting discussions and slide presentations at your winter meeting circuit this year.
Yep, I'd like to see a lot of people at those meetings. We always have something to talk about. I've been doing this for 35 years now, and every year I go to Winter Crops Day, and there's bound to be something that I talk about that I say, I've never seen this before. So,
that's what makes it interesting. Thanks, Tom. We got to run to the news.
You bet. Thanks, Jerry.